But thank you all so much for joining us for tonight's program, The History of New England Sweets, Doughnuts, Bonbons, and Whoopie Pies. So Susan Mara Bregman is an author and photographer who lives in Boston, the Boston area anyway. She received a bachelor's degree from Brown University and a master's degree in city and regional planning from Harvard Kennedy School. After a career in public transportation, working as a public official and private consultant, she has returned to her first loves, writing books and taking photographs. She is the author of New England Neon, New England Candlepin Bowling, and Along Route 1, Maine, New Hampshire, and Massachusetts, all published for Arcadia Publishing. Her photography portfolio is online at www.rednickel.com, and she posts on Instagram and Facebook as Red Nickel Neon. And she is here tonight to discuss her brand new book, New England Sweets, Doughnuts, Bonbons, and Whoopie Pies. So all 250 of us who are watching live and the many more that will watch the recording, let's give a big virtual round of applause to Susan for joining us here tonight. And Susan, you can take it away. Thanks so much.
Great. Thank you, Robert. I snuck a little look at the chat. I see a lot of people love whoopie pies and ribbon candy and ice cream. So that's a good start, because I could probably talk about New England sweets forever, but we'll only be here till about 8. So I'm just going to focus on a few things. I'm going to talk about candy, whoopie pies, fig Newtons, and ice cream. So let me get started. Why is my slide not doing what I want it to do? Okay, there we go. So the Boston area's legacy as a confectionery hub began in 1765 when two men, John Hannon and James Baker, began making chocolate in a mill along the Neponset River on the Milton side of the river. Hannon, unfortunately, was lost at sea in 1779, and Baker, James Baker, took over. He bought the company from Hannon's widow and named it after himself. And that began the legacy of Baker's chocolate. It stayed in the Baker's family for years and years till about the late 1800s and 1895. And the factory itself stayed in Dorchester till 1965. And early chocolate was nothing like the chocolate we eat today. It was bitter, it was gritty, and people mostly enjoyed it as a drink. And it took a series of innovations and inventions in the 1800s to turn that really unrefined product into the chocolate Easter bunnies and bonbons that we enjoy today. But it was really Necco, I would say, that put Boston and Cambridge, of course, on the confectionery map. And I'm going to give you just a super abbreviated version of the rise and fall of one of the most famous candy companies in the country. And it started in 1847 when an apotheker, he was a British apotheker, but he lived in Boston, and his name was Oliver Chase. And he invented a machine that could cut candy lozenges into uniform discs. And you see him here on the left side of your screen. His little machine looks a little like a pasta maker. And you see those discs coming out of the machine, and spoiler alert, they look a lot like Necco wafers, but we're not there yet. But at the time, the reason this pharmacist was making candy was because that's what pharmacists did. They made candy to hide the bitter taste of medicine. So it's like what Mary Poppins said about a spoonful of sugar. So Chase formed a company with his brothers, and they decided to go into the candy business. And their company was called Chase and Company. In 1866, one of the Chase brothers, Daniel, he invented a machine that put printed words on candy wafers. And that, another spoiler alert, looked a lot like those little sweethearts candies we know today. And I'm going to talk about both of those in a minute. So in 1901, Chase and Company merged with two other Boston candy manufacturers. They were called Phobes, Hayward and Company, and Wright and Moody. And together they formed the New England Confectionery Company, or Necco. And Necco's first factory was in the Fort Point Channel in Boston, but they moved to Cambridge in 1927 because land was cheaper. And Necco quickly became one of the anchors of the area that came to be known as Confectioners Row. This was the part of Cambridge that was kind of roughly between Kendall Square and Central Square, really focused along Main Street, if you know Cambridge at all. And I'd say by the mid 40s, there were probably 60-ish candy companies in Cambridge. So there was a huge concentration of candy making going on there. And today there's only one. But Necco prevailed. They survived the Great Depression, World War II, and the ups and downs in the sugar and cocoa markets. But nothing lasts forever. And in 2003, Kendall Square was changing a lot. It was becoming a hub for biotech and big pharma, and real estate prices soared. So Necco consolidated its Massachusetts holdings and moved operations to Revere. And they sold their Mass Ave factory to Novartis in 2004 for a cool $77 million. And then Novartis had to drop another couple of million to get all the sugar out of the walls. So in 2007, Necco was sold to a group of investors, and that was the beginning of the end. Between corporate debt and competition from the big three candy manufacturers, who were Hershey, M&M, Mars, and Nestle, Necco was forced into bankruptcy in 2018. The company's assets were sold at auction, and right now I'm going to talk about some of the Necco brands that survived and one that did not. So, Necco Wafers and Sweethearts. These are probably the most famous Necco candies. And the wafers, as I said, they originated with Oliver Chase's lozenge cutting machine. And the discs were originally sold in rolls of 8 different flavors: chocolate, licorice, cinnamon, lemon, spearmint, sassafras, wintergreen, and clove. So lime replaced the spearmint flavor in the 1930s, and orange took the place of sassafras in the 1940s. And sassafras was subsequently banned as a food flavoring, so just as well. Each roll had a wax paper wrapper sold for a nickel. And as you can see in this old ad here, there was a sister product called Hub Wafers. And as far as I can tell, the only difference between Necco Wafers and Hub Wafers was the wrapping, and Necco had wax paper and Hub Wafers had a transparent wrapper. But, whoops, let's go back. But because Necco Wafers don't need refrigeration, they don't break easily, and they seem to last forever, they traveled across the world. They were taken as provisions on polar expeditions, and they were also used during the World Wars as part of the provisions for soldiers in the field to give them some energy while they were fighting. So conversation hearts are these little guys. They can trace their origin to Daniel Chase's printing machine, but at first, in the 1800s, the candies were called conversation candies, and they weren't necessarily hearts, and they were big enough to actually carry phrases. So they were very popular at parties, and they would say things like, "Married in pink, he will take to drink," or "Married in white, you've chosen right." So Necco made conversation hearts in different shapes until the 60s. And then about 20 years later, they tried bringing back the heart-shaped candies. But the game changer for them came in 1990 when Necco acquired the Stark Candy Company. And Stark had its own successful line of what they called sweethearts, which were those little hearts printed with things like true love and be mine. And then once Necco bought out Stark, Necco could dominate the Valentine's Day candy market, which they did until the bankruptcy auction. So in that auction, an Ohio candy company called Spangler, which was a family-owned company, they rescued Necco Wafers and Sweethearts, and also Canada Mints, and they took a year off to retool, and then they reintroduced Necco Wafers and Sweethearts in 2020. So they are still on the market today. Necco introduced Sky Bar candy in 1938. And Sky Bar was known as a candy box in a bar because the product had 4 separate fillings and each one covered with chocolate, and each one had a different flavor. So the compartments had English toffee, honey nougat, nut butter, and fudge parfait. So Sky Bar's name and branding was designed to tap into the public's fascination with aviation. And the nickel bar was part of Necco's Skyline. You can see here, there was also Sky Toffee and Sky Peps. And continuing with this aviation fixation, they launched Sky Bars with the skywriting campaign. And you can see here the pilot who made letters a mile high in smoke. So that was Sky Bar. So where are Sky Bars today? Well, a woman named Louise Mawhinney. She is a retired technology executive and she owns a gift shop in Sudbury. And she ended up buying the Sky Bar intellectual property at the auction kind of on a whim. She had no confectionery experience and she originally thought she would license production, but then she was convinced to take on the project herself. She had machinery custom made and brought to Sudbury on a flatbed truck. And she set up shop in a little factory next to her gift shop and launched the resurrected Sky Bars in December 2019. And that means Sky Bars today are the only original Necco product that are still made in Massachusetts. So Necco acquired many of its competitors over the years. They started with Lovell and Covell in 1933. They made boxed chocolates. But I want to talk about these two guys. The Squirrel Brand Company began as the Austin T. Merrill Company in Roxbury in 1888. And then a man named Pearlie Garish, he bought the business and changed the name to Squirrel Brand Company and moved it to Cambridge. Squirrel these days is probably best remembered for its nut zippers, which were a vanilla caramel peanut candy. And Squirrel introduced the nut zipper in 1926, and the idea was to create a vanilla complement to its caramel chews, which had a chocolate flavoring. But the nut zipper quickly became Squirrel's most popular product. And the name, supposedly, came from a newspaper story about a Vermont man during Prohibition who was arrested for public drunkenness. And the police found him up in a tree and they had to talk him down. And when they did, they asked him, what was going on? And he said, oh, it must have been the nut zipper. And nut zippers apparently were some sort of alcoholic concoction, but the recipe is lost to history. So Southern Style Nuts purchased Squirrel in 1999 and they moved operations to Texas. But Necco acquired the license for the nut zippers and the caramel chews, brought them back to Massachusetts in 2004. And very sadly, no one picked up the Squirrel candies in the Necco bankruptcy, so they are gone. Squirrel nut zippers now have disappeared from the marketplace, and they only live on in the name of the swing band that borrowed the name years ago. So Mary Jane was developed in 1914. A man named Charles N. Miller created a molasses taffy with a peanut butter filling, and he named it after his father's sister, his Aunt Mary Jane. And the penny candies had a very distinctive yellow and red branding, and this illustration of a girl in a bonnet and her little red Mary Janes. So Charles' son Alton Miller took over the company in 1921, and he really went to town on branding and marketing, and they had Mary Jane contests and personal appearances by young women who were dressed as the Mary Jane character. But eventually Stark, the same company that made Sweethearts, Stark acquired Miller in 1985. And then when Necco acquired Stark in 1990, Necco began manufacturing Mary Janes. Spangler also picked up Mary Jane in the bankruptcy, but they licensed production to a company in Texas called Atkinson Candy, which is also home to the, I'd say, delightfully named coconut peanut butter candy called Chico Stick. And they still produce Mary Jane's under a licensing agreement with Spangler. So Daggett Chocolate was once one of the biggest candy manufacturers in Cambridge and the third largest boxed candy company in the country. It was founded by Fred L. Daggett. He was born in Maine in 1870. And by the late 1890s, he was running a candy company in Boston. Sometime around 1900, his company moved to Lewis Wharf on the Boston waterfront, but moved its operations to Cambridge like so many other candy companies in 1926, and they moved to 400 Main Street. Daggett's thrived in its new Cambridge location and continued to produce its own fine chocolates, but just like Necco did, it expanded operations by buying out its competitors. So by 1933, Daggett's had acquired Page and Shaw, which this was their factory also in Cambridge. And they have a pretty interesting history that involves stock fraud, among other things. But also they acquired F.H. Roberts, F.H. Dow, and the Walter Lowney Company. And also they acquired Gobelin chocolates probably in the 50s. So by 1952, Daggett's was using about 10 million pounds of cocoa beans a year and 6 million pounds of sugar. So they were a big player. And in its heyday, Daggett's was producing 40 different lines of chocolate, and it made the boxes as well. And they also had a factory in Virginia that supplied the strawberries they used in some of their chocolates. So let me just talk about this picture on the upper right for a minute. That's Fred Daggett on the left. That's Meredith Phelan, who worked at the company. I think she was his second wife's sister-in-law, something like that. And that is Massachusetts politician Christian Herter Jr. And this was a fundraiser for the American Heart Association, which is why there's a box full of money there. So Fred Daggett died in 1958 at the age of 87, and his nephew took over the company. But Daggett's death was really the beginning of the end, and Necco acquired Daggett's in 1960 and added Daggett's dozens of brands to its extensive portfolio. And MIT bought the Main Street factory, and they still own it today. So each one of these Massachusetts classics is still made today. None of them is made by Necco, and each one has a sort of theatrical connection. In 1927, James O. Welch opened a candy company named after himself, and this was at 810 Main Street in Cambridge. And the Welch Company introduced several well-known candy brands, including Sugar Daddy, Junior Mints, and Pom Poms. Sugar Daddy was first, and it's a caramel sucker on a stick, basically. And in fact, its original name was Papa Sucker, but eventually they changed the name to Sugar Daddy in 1932. Sugar Babies and Sugar Mama came later, and the Sugar family was complete by 1965. And although some sources claim this is true, I am pretty sure it is not. Sugar Babies were not, in fact, named after the Mickey Rooney and Ann Miller musical. That came later in 1979. Junior Mints were launched in 1949. And that candy's name also has a theatrical connection. It was inspired by Junior Miss, which was a popular book, play, and radio show during the 1940s. And Junior Mints also has a connection to the Seinfeld show, which we can talk about in the Q&A if you want. So Charleston Chews came to Cambridge from California, and their story is Don Lee Cross was a Shakespearean actor in San Francisco at the turn of the last century, so 1900-ish. And he fell and got injured, and he couldn't act anymore, so he did what anyone would do. He opened a candy company. He teamed up with his friend Charlie Fox, and they opened the Fox Cross Company in 1920. And somehow Foxcross ended up in Cambridge by 1931. No one really quite knows when or how exactly. And they were on Main Street by 1946. So Foxcross introduced the Charleston Chew in 1922, which was a vanilla flavored nougat covered in milk chocolate. And it was named not after Charlestown, Massachusetts, but it was named after the Charleston dance craze of the 20s. A few decades later, a man named Nathan Sloan bought Foxcroft in 1957. He moved the company to Everett and added new flavors and modernized production, but he's most remembered for encouraging customers to freeze their Charleston chews and smack them on a hard surface to create bite-sized pieces. And they became known as the Charleston Crack, and it became a sensation. So Nabisco acquired both companies, James O. Welch and Foxcross, and later sold them to Warner Lambert. And then Tootsie Roll Industries came in, acquired the Warner Lambert candy lines. And today, Tootsie Roll makes Charleston Chews and Junior Mints at the same 810 Main Street factory that James O. Welch opened in the 20s. And that makes Tootsie the last active candy factory in the city of Cambridge. So Needhams are chocolate-covered squares of sweetened potato coconut candy, and they have a long history in Maine. But the story's a little fuzzy, and some of the details are probably not true. But sources agree on the basic elements. There was a man named John Seavey. He owned a shop in Auburn in the late 1800s. And one of his employees showed him a chocolate-covered coconut candy around 1872. Seavey liked them, he wanted to sell them, but he needed a name for his new candy. So now we look toward a man named Needham, not Needham, Massachusetts, by the way. This was George C. Needham. He was an evangelist who was born in Ireland around 1844, arrived in Boston sometime around 1870, and began preaching at the Tremont Temple Baptist Church in Boston. But the really fun part of the story is how and when Needham left Ireland and came to North America. Because the Globe, the Boston Globe, says he became an evangelist in Dublin when he was around 20 and preached in England and Ireland till 1868 when he crossed the ocean. But the New York Times printed a very different story. And that story put Needham on a ship from Ireland to South America when he was 10 years old. And according to this story, which is probably not true, he was beaten, tortured, and tattooed by the captain and crew and dumped in Patagonia. And here's what the Times said. They said, and I'm quoting here, he was found by a band of cannibal Indians who considered him a delicate morsel and was prepared to make a feast of him. But he was saved at the last moment by the superstition of the Indians, who discovered the strange tattoo marks on his body. Take it or leave it. I cannot tell you whether that story is true. I do know that Needham eventually does end up in Boston around 1870 and held revival meetings across the US, and Maine was one of his destinations. So Seavey probably knew about George Needham. Maybe he went to a meeting, maybe he read the papers, and everyone says he named his candies after the preacher. So Seavey Sweets continued to make and sell Needhams till the 60s when Lou Rod Candy of Lewiston bought them out, and Lou Rod sold Needhams until 2013. So what about the potatoes? Folklore says that Seavey's and Lou Rod's both used potatoes in their Needhams, but potatoes don't show up on the lists of ingredients on their packaging. But they did show up in home kitchens because generations of home cooks in Maine made Needhams, especially around the holidays. And Needham recipes in cookbooks in the early 20th century included potatoes. Maybe it was a cheap ingredient. Coconut was probably expensive and a little harder to find. Potatoes were easier, especially in Maine. And maybe it was just a way to use up leftover mashed potatoes from dinner the night before. Whatever the reason, Needhams included potatoes starting in the 20th century. And today, the Maine Needham Company is trying to revive Needhams and does in fact use potatoes in their treats. A woman named Linda Lenberg was a home cook in Norway, Maine, and she was making and selling Needhams from her kitchen, but decided to retire after about a dozen years. And she sold the business to Malika and Gerard Picard in 2019, and they are a couple in Saco. And they made Needhams in their home, but moved to a factory in 2023. But besides making candy, the Picards themselves are Needham evangelists, and they're trying to keep the history of Maine Needhams alive. And they helped create Maine Needham Day, which is celebrated on the fourth Saturday in September. So this picture was in the Lowell Sun, so I thought I would share it with you today. Before I leave candy, I just want to mention one of the chocolatiers and chocolate makers across New England. There are way, way, way too many to mention tonight, but only one has a chocolate mousse. Len Libby began making candy in 1926, and he first sold it from his home in Scarborough and later opened a shop. He sold his business in the 40s to a man named Fernand Hemond, and Hemond moved the business to Route 1, where it still is today. And Hemond's granddaughter and her husband run the shop today. And some of Len Libby's popular candies are Bangor Taffy, which is not taffy, and Needhams, which the shop makes from hand-shredded coconut, but does not use potatoes. And but Len Libby's is mostly known for Lenny the Chocolate Mousse, which is a life-size chocolate sculpture created in 1997. And he has since been joined by a mama bear and her two cubs. So let's talk about whoopie pies. Let's start with the basics. A whoopie pie is not a pie. It's 2 mounds of chocolate cake surrounding a white creamy filling, although the variations are endless. 3 states can credibly lay claim to the whoopie pie as their own: Maine, Pennsylvania, and Massachusetts. Each state traces the treat to the 1920s. And they're especially popular in Maine and Pennsylvania, and both states have whoopie pie festivals. Maine has held its whoopie pie festival since 2008 as a benefit for the Center Theater in Dover Foxcroft. And Rutland, Vermont, which has no other apparent connection to whoopie pies, started its own whoopie pie festival in 2022. So whoopie pies were named the official Maine state treat in 2011, but the designation was a little controversial. Legislators first wanted to name whoopie pies as the official state dessert, but they ran into opposition from the wild blueberry lobby. And they eventually had to reach a dessert compromise. The whoopie pie could be the official state treat, and the wild blueberry pie became the official state dessert. And for whatever reason, Governor LePage did not sign the whoopie pie bill. He said he had more important things to do. I can't imagine what they could have been. But the designation took place in 2011 anyway, without his signature. So let's talk about some of these origin stories. Maine's connection to the whoopie can be traced to Labadee's Bakery in Lewiston. And that family-owned bakery sold its first whoopie pie in 1925 and still follows the same recipe. And the Labadee's origin story is widely accepted throughout Maine. And the only thing about the story, I would say, is that it doesn't really explain the origin of the name. In Pennsylvania, there are people who trace the whoopie pie to a bakery in Johnstown. And in that story, a bakery worker had a couple of pieces of chocolate cake and made himself a little sandwich with some filling, and the whoopie pie was born. The bakery started selling them, but they called them gob cakes, which is kind of a slang term in the coal mining industry. Another Pennsylvania story puts whoopie pies in the kitchens of home bakers in the Amish community, saying that the cakes were a practical way to make use of leftover cake batter. And they would tuck the treats into lunch boxes for their kids and their husbands, and they would open them up at lunchtime and go whoopee when they found the desserts. You can take that with a grain of salt. Then there's the Massachusetts whoopie pie story, which takes us to the Berwick Cake Company in Roxbury. The Berwick Company was originally focused on Berwick sponge cake, which is a different Maine delicacy and was named after the North Berwick station on the Boston and Maine Railroad. But the company, here's an ad for them on the left, they added whoopie pies to their offerings sometime between 1926 and 1931. And some people think that maybe another Berwick confection inspired whoopie pies because they made devil dogs, which, let's face it, is sort of a hot dog shaped chocolate cake with a white filling. There's some speculation that Berwick sold its recipe for devil dogs to Drake's, but the facts are a little fuzzy. Regardless, Berwick was making whoopie pies by 1931. And there's another theater twist here. In October of 1928, the stage show called Whoopie, which starred Eddie Cantor, came to Boston. And Eddie Cantor, as the story goes, was on stage singing the song Makin' Whoopie. And supposedly the crew was handing out these whoopie pies to the audience. And we don't know whether the pies were maybe named after the song or what, but it was certainly a match made in confectionery heaven. Now, these I found in New Hampshire. These are whoopie donuts, which are cider donuts with a layer of frosting in between, kind of marrying the best of both states here. So, fig Newtons, fig rolls were once considered a health food. They were considered as beneficial to digestion. And they were popular with home cooks across Great Britain, and British immigrants probably brought them to the US. But it really took a combination of a cookie maker, an inventor, and a bakery to turn the humble fig roll into the fig Newton, which was one of the best-selling cookies in the country. So a man named Frank Kennedy, he operated the F.A. Kennedy Steam Bakery. The building is still standing in Cambridge here. You can see his name on the side. And his company was sometimes called Kennedy Biscuit Works. It's on Franklin Street in Cambridge, kind of near the Necco factory. A man named Charles Martin Roser was an Ohio man, and he was widely credited with developing the recipe for the fig cookie that he sold to Kennedy. James Henry Mitchell was an inventor in Philadelphia, and he developed the machine that could fill a cookie crust with fruit. Some people say he sold his machine to Kennedy Biscuit Works. Other people say he worked there. Either way, the machine was the key to taking fig rolls from the home kitchen to the assembly line. So that was the magical combination that brought this new cookie to the market in 1891. And fig Newtons were, in fact, named after the city of Newton, and many of Kennedy's products were named after Massachusetts communities, including Shrewsbury, Melrose, Brighton, and Cambridge. So in 1898, Kennedy Biscuit Works became part of the National Biscuit Company, which we know as Nabisco, and Nabisco occupied that factory for decades. Nabisco, of course, still makes fig Newtons, but they dropped fig from the name in 2012. Kennedy Biscuit Works was converted to housing, and it was placed on the National Register of Historic Places. And the city of Newton has totally embraced its role in cookie history. And Newton's long-serving mayor, the late Ted Mann, was known to keep a stash of fig Newtons in his office and hand them out to visitors. and subsequent mayors pretty much do the same thing. And Fig Newtons almost became the official Massachusetts state cookie in 1997 because Governor Weld supported that designation. The legislators wanted to name the Toll House cookie the state cookie, but Weld was a fan of Fig Newtons, and he said, everyone I knew grew up with Fig Newtons. The packaging is distinct, they're delicious, and I think out of respect for Ted Mann, that alone should lead us to cast our lot with the Fig Newton. But he lost that battle, and ultimately he signed Toll House cookies into law as the Massachusetts state cookie. So New Englanders are well known for eating ice cream all year round, even when there's a raging blizzard outside. Here's just a small sampling of the major ice cream chains in New England. Newport Creamery, mostly in Rhode Island and southeastern Mass. Home of the Awful Awful. Bailey's, remembered for its overflowing fudge sundaes. Friendly's, home of the Fribble. And Brigham's, which Brigham's was kind of known for chocolate jimmies, I would say. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention Vermont creemees, which is a rich version of soft serve ice cream, and the traditional flavor is maple. But tonight, I really want to focus on a few ice cream pioneers who disrupted the industry in the 1970s and 1980s. Steve Harrell, Ben Cohen, and Jerry Greenfield. You know them by their first names. In 1973, a 29-year-old Steve Harrell pretty much revolutionized ice cream in Somerville, Massachusetts. He transformed a former dry cleaning shop into an ice cream shop that was furnished with mismatched tables and chairs, a player piano, and most important, a 5-gallon ice and salt ice cream maker. Steve's Ice Cream opened on June 29th, 1973, and it was an instant success. And waiting in line for Steve's was a rite of passage in the mid-70s. I certainly did it myself. But two things really set Steve's apart from the beginning: the quality of the ice cream and the novelty of the mix-ins. Steve served rich, creamy, small batch ice cream that had a low volume of air mixed in. And if you've ever made ice cream, you know that the process calls for agitating a mix of cream plus sugar and flavorings until it freezes. And it's the agitation that incorporates air into the mixture, and it uses a moving blade called a dasher. So the speed of the dasher controls the amount of air in the finished product. The slower the dasher moves, the less air is introduced, and the less air, the creamier and denser the ice cream. So to offer his signature ice cream, Steve Harrell modified his White Mountain freezer with an engine so it would churn the ice cream slowly enough to create a super premium low air product. Steve's also introduced mix-ins, or as he later called them, smush-ins. And the concept was pretty simple. Instead of sprinkling extras like candies and nuts on top of the ice cream, the servers would mix the goodies into the ice cream directly, creating a customized flavor. So maybe it was coffee ice cream with Heath bars or chocolate with Oreos. And in his memoir, Steve said, and I'm quoting, "Before I opened Steve's, to my knowledge, no ice cream anywhere contained chopped Heath bars, Reese's cups, Oreos, M&Ms, and other nationally popular candies. Once Steve's opened, the baked goods and candy industries were thereby forever married to the ice cream industry." And while Harrell loved ice cream, he didn't love running a scoop shop, and he sold his business in 1977. He sold it to Joey Crugnali, who also owned Bertucci's and also owned Bailey's at one point. But after a series of sales and corporate takeovers, Steve's ultimately closed in the late 1990s. But in the meantime, Harrell became a piano tuner and moved to Northampton. And he wanted to make ice cream again. So when his non-compete clause expired in 1980, He opened Harold's Homemade Ice Cream in Northampton. He couldn't use the name Steve's because he had sold it. Harold's followed the same model as the original Steve's: thick, creamy ice cream, interesting flavors, and smush-ins. And he ran his namesake store alongside his wife and later ex-wife, Judy Harrell, until he retired in 2013. And today, Judy runs the Northampton shop, and she recently added an outlet in Amherst. So a year after Steve sold his ice cream store, a couple of guys from New York founded another ice cream dynasty, and this one was in Vermont. Ben Cohen and Jerry Greenfield met in a 7th grade gym class on Long Island in New York. And they became best friends. And a few years later, they were kind of contemplating their stalled career options. Ben Cohen had dropped out of college. He wanted to become a potter, but he had no customers. Jerry Greenfield applied to medical school, but no one accepted him. So they decided to go into the ice cream business together. They took a correspondence course, and they found a rundown gas station with a leaky roof in Burlington, Vermont. And Ben and Jerry's opened in 1978. And besides the leaky roof, their scoop shop had a 5-gallon rock salt and ice freezer and a player piano, just like Steve's. So Cohen and Greenfield set out to make a rich and creamy product. And a lot of that, as we saw, came down to the speed of the dasher, but they didn't know how fast or how slow it could go. So they kind of did surveillance. They went to other small ice cream shops and kind of surreptitiously counted the revolutions on their ice cream makers. So Fred Lager, who wrote a book about Ben and Jerry's, said, if 20 per minute worked for Steve's in Cambridge, although he meant Somerville, they figured that 20 per minute would work for them. So years later, in an interview in the Boston Phoenix, Ben and Jerry talked about the influence of Steve on their business. And they said that certainly, this is a quote from Jerry, certainly before we started, we came and visited Steve's Ice Cream in Somerville, and we spoke with Steve Harrell, who was really amazingly helpful for someone who didn't know us at all and had no reason to be helpful. He was just a really nice guy and very helpful, and he still makes great ice cream. And we owe a great debt of gratitude to Steve Harrell. So Ben and Jerry's, of course, is known for its really intense flavors with the cute names. And the flavors were created out of necessity because Ben Cohen didn't really have a good sense of smell. And if you don't have a good sense of smell, you don't have a good sense of taste. So the challenge was for Jerry to create flavors that Ben could recognize with his eyes closed. And to do that, the ice creams had to be super intensely flavored. And they were also super chunky. They first tried to follow the Harrell's, the Steve's example and mix in candies and cookies on demand at their shop, but they never quite got the hang of it, and it didn't really work out for them. So they figured out it would be much easier to dump the candy and the cookies into the ice cream while it was being cranked. And that's how Ben and Jerry's flavors were born. And of course, Ben and Jerry's are also known for their political activism, but I'm not going to get into that tonight. I will talk about fluff. So marshmallow fluff, as we all know, is a sweet, white, gooey spread used as an ingredient in everything from fudge to whoopie pies. And of course, some people just eat it straight out of the jar. So a French-Canadian immigrant named Archibald, I'm not sure how to say his name. Some people say Query. I think it's probably Kerry or Kerry. He was a French-Canadian immigrant living in Somerville around the turn of the 20th century. And he developed a recipe for marshmallow cream in 1917, so before World War I. And he sold it door to door. Fred Mower and Alan Durkee were childhood friends who grew up in Swampscott, and they served together in France during World War I. But Mower met Query when both were working at the Walter Lowney Company's factory on Commercial Street in downtown Boston. And Mower and Durkee purchased Query's marshmallow cream recipe for $500. And they opened the Durkee Mower Company on Valentine's Day in 1920. And they opened this in their hometown of Swampscott. And they originally, because they had served in France, they wanted to make a little pun. So they originally called it Toot Sweet Marshmallow Fluff, but they dropped the Toot Sweet at some point. The original recipe for fluff consisted of 4 ingredients: sugar, corn syrup, egg whites, and vanilla. They eventually moved to a factory in Lynn in 1929, and they're still there today. So fluff was popular enough. It grew steadily for the next few decades. There were tons and tons of advertisements. They sponsored radio shows. They had musical acts known as the Flufferettes. But fluff really achieved iconic status in 1958 when Durkee Mower rolled out the Fluffernutter, which of course is a sandwich made with peanut butter and marshmallow fluff. The Fluffernutter name and the catchy advertising jingle, which is stuck in my head, proved irresistible, and Fluffernutters became a favorite of school children across New England. There was even a little legislative kerfuffle when Cambridge State Senator Jarrett Barrios wanted Cambridge schools to limit how often they could serve Fluffernutters in the Cambridge public schools for lunch, but he got shot down in a spectacular way. Anyhow, since 2006, Union Square Main Streets in Somerville has been hosting the What the Fluff Street Festival to honor marshmallow fluff and its inventor, Archibald Query. So, thank you. That's New England Sweets. These are cocoa pods, by the way, and inside of them are seeds that are roasted and become chocolate. So, thank you, and I'm happy to answer any questions and maybe catch my breath.
So, folks, let's give Susan a big virtual round of applause for a great presentation. And we can take 10 minutes of questions. If you have a question for Susan, please type it into the Q&A box. If you have a comment, feel free to type it into the chat box. Let's see. JM says this was excellent. Thanks so much. Gail says thank you. Teresa says absolutely fascinating. JA says this was fantastic. And folks, I'm still waiting for my first question. Let's see. So Lois asks, is the red, white, and blue colors of fluff packaging deliberate?
Not to my knowledge. You mean, is it somehow patriotic? I don't really know. I haven't really heard anything to that effect.
Jenna asks, what is your favorite place to get whoopie pies?
Well, you know, there's no such thing as a bad whoopie pie. I'll start by saying that. My favorite whoopie pie is probably the first whoopie pie I had in Maine, which was at Moody's Diner. I'm a big fan of Moody's Diner in Waldoboro. It's figured in 2 of my books because it has a big neon sign and it's along Route 1. And I really like their pumpkin whoopie pie. But I will also add that I've been a judge now at the Whoopie Pie Festival for 2 years running, and I've tasted a lot of whoopie pies. And there's so many variations, I couldn't even begin to narrow it down.
Well, speaking of tasting, Larry asks, did you sample all of these candies personally, and which is your favorite?
I sampled a lot of them. I didn't sample every single candy. Honestly, I've always been a fan of junior mints. I know they're not particularly exotic, but I kind of love them. But I would say Maine Needhams, that was kind of a revelation to me. And I really enjoy them. I mean, when I first heard about them, I'm like, you know, potato in candy? What's that? but they're really good. And also Sky bars. I didn't grow up around here, so I didn't grow up with Sky bars, but I've tasted the ones that Louise is making, and they're really, really, really good.
Irene wants to know what the heck happened to Brigham's. I grew up in Massachusetts, but I don't live here anymore.
Brigham's is gone. Um, you know, what the heck happened to Brigham's? Like a lot of these old school ice cream chains, it was a little, it couldn't meet changing tastes. I mean, companies like Ben and Jerry's and ice cream shops like Steve's or later Toscanini's and Rankatori's, they really created a new market for this premium ice cream. And companies like Brigham's just kind of couldn't compete in that new environment. And it just kind of basically went away.
Nancy wants to know, can you tell us anything about the Toll House cookie?
Well, the Toll House cookie originated at the Toll House, which was a restaurant in, oh, Whitman, Massachusetts. And the woman who invented them was a cook, a well-known cook named Ruth Wakefield. And some people say she invented them by accident, but other people really take offense at that story and say she knew what she was doing. And she made this cookie with, they didn't have chocolate chips at the time. She had to sort of shave pieces of chocolate off bars of baking chocolate. And people loved them. It was during the Depression. And, some people say, well, it was great. It was like a little bit of sweetness that everybody could afford during the Depression. And the interesting thing was she basically ended up in a partnership with Nestle's, who started making chocolate chips and packaging them and selling them specifically so people could use them in cookies. So the chocolate chip itself was invented after the cookie.
All right, so Leslie wants you to come back and tell us more about donuts next time. Ellen
Okay.
wants to know, what are some of the best donut shops you've visited? And we have, let's see, someone in the chat. Where is it? Rachel wants to know, are cider donuts only a New England confection?
Okay, so I'll say cider donuts are some of my favorite donuts in New England. So I'll start by saying that. And I did eat one of those whoopie donuts. um, Cider donuts are not exclusively a New England confection. I would say anywhere that has a big apple production crop has cider donuts. So upstate New York has cider donuts. I think Washington State has cider donuts. It really is kind of a partner with apple orchards, basically, and farm stands. And it's just another way for orchards to have a product to sell.
A few folks in the chat noting that while the Brigham's restaurants have closed, the ice cream continues to be produced in quarts that are available in supermarkets around New England.
That is true. And H.P. Hood makes them.
Yeah.
H.P. Hood took over the Brigham's supermarket brand.
Yeah. Let's see here. And I know there's still a few Friendlies around kicking, but similarly, Friendlies ice cream is available in grocery stores. All right, let's see. There's so many questions. This is overwhelming. Somebody wants to know about saltwater taffy. Edward says, I remember going to Nantasket Beach as a kid and seeing the candy machine pulling the taffy at the food stand. Fond childhood memories. Anything you can tell us about saltwater taffy, Susan?
So saltwater taffy does not have salt water. We'll start with that. It's kind of a marketing gimmick. And it probably was invented in Atlantic City. But most seaside towns have taffy. And there are a few famous taffy stories in New England. I wrote about a couple in Maine in my book. There's one in York Beach in Maine called the Goldenrod, and they call their taffy Goldenrod Kisses. because Kisses used to be kind of a generic name for any small piece of candy. It didn't exclusively belong to Hershey's until later. And there's also a very interesting story about a man named Herbert. Herbert? I forget his first name. I think it was Herbert Hildreth, who was born in Massachusetts in, I think, Grafton or North Grafton, ends up learning how to make candy in Maine, has a factory in Boston's South End, but really settles down in Old Orchard Beach, where he becomes like this big deal in Old Orchard Beach. And he made a taffy called Velvet Kisses. And he got involved in a patent fight because until about 1900, taffy was made by hand. And it was a very laborious process. You basically boil this big batch of sugar or molasses till it's this big blob. And then they have these hooks in the wall, and you sort of throw the candy onto this hook. And then you have to kind of pull it and knead it and fold it and pull it and knead it until it incorporates enough air to soften. So it was a very labor intensive process that required a lot of strength. And around 1900, a whole bunch of people invented variations on a machine that could do the pulling job mechanically. And there was a big taffy fight that went all the way to the Supreme Court. And Hildreth was involved in that fight, and he somehow managed to prevail. And he kind of transitioned in a lot of ways from making taffy to selling taffy machines.
We'll take a few more questions, folks. We'll go a few minutes over. Jennifer wants to know, what would you say is a singular quality that these amazing inventors had in common that led them to such spectacular success?
Well, that's a hard question. Sometimes it was luck, I hate to say, but I think there was, especially in the candy industry, there was this, they were all a lot of them were concentrated in Cambridge. It was an era of creativity and innovation, and they all knew each other. There were these confectionery associations, and they all had meetings, and they worked for each other, and they bought each other out. And you can't copyright a recipe. So there was a lot of, we'll just say, borrowing going on. And I think it just all kind of built on itself. And I think they were just greater together than they might have been individually.
So I feel bad not being able to get to so many questions here, but let me ask you this one. Let's see. A lot of folks actually asking about recipes. Do you have any recipes for whoopie pies? Any cookbooks that you might recommend as it relates to whoopie pies or other New England sweets?
So the book has a handful of recipes, but they're not really like the kind of recipes you can go make in your kitchen. They're more like reprinting recipes from historical sources. I think there's a lot of interesting stuff in Yankee Magazine, I would say. They cover a lot of these New England foods pretty extensively and have a lot of recipes. And there are some other books out there on whoopie pies that have recipes. And I would just Google and see what you find. I don't have a specific book that I would recommend or not recommend.
Jackie asks, wondering why so many candy factories ended up in Cambridge. Was that the proximity to Boston, or why was that?
I think it's a few things. In the beginning, a lot of them were in Boston, and that's because of proximity to population, both a workforce and customer base, and the proximity to shipping, railroads and boats, ships. In the early years, this was before refrigerated, before trucks, basically. And so a lot of them end up moving to Cambridge because land was cheaper and they could build bigger factories. So that's why originally, I know it's hard to believe now that land was cheaper in Cambridge, but it was. And they had more room, so they could expand. And then I think again, it's like any of those things. Once one company comes and another company comes, they all start clustering together because they're competing, but they're also colleagues and they know each other and they're buying each other out. And I think it just became like this convergence of like anything, like, you know, tech firms along 128. It's just the way things work.
So, Susan, any last words for the audience before we wrap things up?
Oh my goodness. It was just, I mean, you could probably tell how much fun this book was to research and to write. And there are so many stories. There are stories I didn't have room to fit in the book, and there are certainly stories I didn't have room to talk about tonight. And it's a fascinating topic, and I really enjoyed researching it, and it's been such a pleasure to talk about it with you all. So I want to thank you for the opportunity.
Great presentation, Susan. It's going to do a number on my diet here. I'm very hungry at the moment here, so
Yeah,
I'm
well,
gonna do my best, Susan.
do your
But I want
best.
to thank you so much. Wonderful presentation, folks. Let's give Susan one big last virtual round of applause. I also
Thank
want to
you.
thank the Friends of the Library and all the other public libraries who helped promote tonight's talk. As a reminder, you'll receive a recording tomorrow morning, and please take the feedback survey that should pop up when you exit the Zoom. So thank you all so much, and I hope everyone stays cool and stays dry. All right, have a good one, Susan.
Thank you, Robert. Thanks, everyone. It was a pleasure.